It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Tessa laughed as she flicked a greasy shrimp tail onto Ginger J. Bradley's lap in front of the entire country club dining room. The orange-pink curve of the shell tumbled down Ginger's silk skirt, leaving a streak of butter and cocktail sauce across the fabric before landing in a pathetic heap on the floor. The founder's room went silent. At the head of the long mahogany table, Uncle Alan paused with his wine glass halfway to his lips. Aunt Lorna winced, her eyes darting toward the neighboring tables where the local elite were already beginning to whisper. Cousin Abby looked down at her plate, her knuckles white as she gripped her fork. "Oops," Tessa said, her voice ringing with performative innocence. She didn't look sorry. She looked exhilarated. She leaned back in her velvet-backed chair, the sharp, rhythmic clack-clack of her designer heels against the marble floor sounding like a countdown. "I forgot you were sitting there, Ginger. You're just so quiet lately. It's like you've faded into the wallpaper along with that hideous cardigan." Ginger didn't move. She felt the cold, oily weight of the sauce soaking through her skirt, a direct hit to the one nice thing she had left. Her hands stayed flat on the linen tablecloth, her fingers brushing the edge of the smartphone hidden beneath her napkin. "Tessa, really?" Evelyn Bradley murmured, though there was no bite in her tone. The mother of the two girls adjusted her pearls, the cloying, heavy scent of her gardenia perfume wafting across the table like a physical shroud. "Don't tease your sister. She's had a very difficult few months. The recovery has been taxing on all of us." "Taxing on your bank account, you mean?" Tessa snapped, reaching for the chilled silver water pitcher. The condensation on the metal was slick, reflecting the overhead crystal chandelier. "I don't know why we had to bring her tonight anyway. She's a buzzkill. We're here to celebrate my boutique's expansion, not to babysit a data analyst who can barely walk a straight line." "I can walk just fine, Tessa," Ginger said. Her voice was low, steady, and devoid of the tears Tessa clearly wanted. "Barely," Tessa sneered. She gestured vaguely at Ginger's leg hidden beneath the table. "And let's be honest, that little job of yours is basically a hobby, sorting through spreadsheets for pennies while the rest of us actually run the family legacy. It's embarrassing." Evelyn sighed, a dramatic, suffering sound. "Ginger, dear, don't be difficult. Tessa is right about one thing. The expenses have been astronomical. In fact, I had to move some things around this morning. I sold that old SUV of yours." "You weren't using it, and the insurance was simply too much." Ginger's heart gave a singular, sharp thud against her ribs. "You sold my car? I bought that with my own savings, Mom. I need it for my physical therapy appointments." "Oh, stop being so dramatic," Evelyn said, dismissively waving a hand weighted down by a 5-carat diamond. "We're a family. What's yours is ours. Besides, Tessa needed the liquidity for the new lease in the city. You should be happy to contribute to your sister's success for once." Aunt Lorna cleared her throat, looking uncomfortable. "Evelyn, surely Ginger's medical recovery comes first?" "Ginger is fine," Tessa interrupted, her eyes flashing with entitlement. "She's just milking it so she doesn't have to work. She's always been the parasite of this family. A boring, gray little leech." Ginger felt the familiar heat of rage rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down, turning it into something cold and sharp. She looked at Tessa Bradley, really looked at her. The perfectly blown-out hair, the $3,000 dress, the smug curve of a mouth that had never known the taste of a real consequence. Ginger's thumb found the side button of her phone under the table. She felt the haptic vibration, one long, too short. The signal was received. "You're right, Tessa," Ginger said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I have been very quiet. Recovery gives you a lot of time to observe things, to look at patterns, to see where things go missing." Tessa's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, her glass stopping midair. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Just that I'm a data analyst," Ginger replied. She picked up her water glass, her hand perfectly steady. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. "I'm very good at finding things that people think are buried. It's not a hobby, it's a skill." "You're delusional," Tessa spat, but she shifted in her seat. She turned to the rest of the table, her voice rising to regain control of the room. "See, this is what I mean. She's bitter. She can't stand that I'm the one actually making something of the Bradley name while she rots in a cubicle." Uncle Alan finally spoke, his brow furrowed as he looked between the sisters. "Ginger, if you have something to say, say it. This isn't the place for riddles." Ginger looked at her uncle, the only man in the family who still valued the concept of an audit. Then she looked back at her sister. Tessa was preening again, basking in the attention of the surrounding tables, oblivious to the storm gathering in the quiet girl beside her. "I don't have anything else to say tonight," Ginger said. She stood up, her movements deliberate. She didn't limp, she didn't stumble. She took the linen napkin from her lap and dropped it over the greasy shrimp tail on the floor, covering the mess her sister had made. "Where are you going?" Evelyn demanded, her face tightening with social anxiety as she noticed the neighbors watching. "The main course hasn't even arrived." "I have some work to finish," Ginger said. She leaned down, her lips brushing Tessa's ear. She caught the scent of her sister's expensive, floral perfume, a scent that would soon be associated with a very different memory. "Enjoy the lobster, Tessa," Ginger whispered. "It's the last thing you'll ever eat on my dime." Ginger walked out of the founder's room, her head held high. She didn't look back at the confused silence she left behind. Once she reached the marble foyer, she pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen was illuminated with a single notification from an encrypted server. Audit complete. Total diverted funds identified, $4.2 million. Authorization required to freeze Bradley Retail Corp accounts. Ginger J. Bradley swiped the screen, her thumb hovering over the confirm button. The recovery period was over. The silent auditor was done watching. She pressed the button and stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of her own heels marking the beginning of the end. The sunroom of the Bradley estate smelled of jasmine, and the sharp, metallic tang of the floor waxed the staff applied every Tuesday morning. Ginger J. Bradley sat in a high-backed velvet chair, the morning light illuminating the steam rising from her Earl Grey. She looked every bit the convalescing daughter they expected her to be, her posture soft, her gaze fixed on the manicured gardens. But beneath the silk hem of her robe, her pulse beat with the steady, rhythmic precision of a ticking bomb. The silence was shattered by the rhythmic, frantic clicking of acrylic nails against a smartphone screen. Tessa Bradley marched into the room, her face a mask of high society fury. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't ask how her sister had slept after her first night back from the clinic. Instead, she slammed a designer handbag onto the glass table, the impact vibrating through Ginger's teacup. "What did you do to the internal server?" Tessa demanded, her voice shrill. "I've been trying to process the deposit for the Mykonos villa for 20 minutes, and the corporate card keeps bouncing like a rubber ball. Fix it." Ginger didn't look up from her tea. The liquid was bitter, oversteeped, just the way she needed it to be this morning. "I was running the end-of-quarter integrity checks last night, Tessa. The system might be sluggish during the data migration." "Sluggish," Tessa sneered, leaning over the table until the scent of her cloying, floral perfume choked the air. "It's not sluggish, it's dead, and I have a flight in 4 hours. I told you when you crawled back here that your only job was to stay out of the way and keep the digital books clean while I handle the real work. You're a glorified bookkeeper, Ginger. A charity case we kept on the payroll while you were busy having a nervous breakdown in that expensive hospital." The insult hung in the air, a deliberate barb designed to draw blood. Ginger merely set her cup down. The porcelain clicked against the saucer with terrifying steadiness. "My breakdown, as you call it, was clinical exhaustion from covering the $4 million in discrepancies you and Mother created while Uncle Alan was in London last year." Tessa's laugh was a jagged, ugly thing. She checked her reflection in the sunroom's mirrored wall, smoothing her perfectly coiffed hair. "Discrepancies, please. It's called creative accounting. Besides, I needed a little extra for the fall collection. And speaking of extras..." She reached into her bag and tossed a crumpled slip of paper onto Ginger's lap. "I needed to cover the tailoring on my gala gown yesterday. Since the corporate card was acting up, I used your personal emergency account. It was only $10,000. Consider it a welcome-home gift to me." Ginger looked down at the receipt. $10,000. It was the exact amount Aunt Lorna had set aside for Ginger's physical therapy and post-recovery care. Tessa hadn't just stolen the money. She had stolen the means of Ginger's independence, and she had done it with the casual indifference of someone swatting a fly. "That money was for my specialist, Tessa," Ginger said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous simmer. "Oh, please, you look fine. You can walk, can't you?" Tessa waved a hand dismissively, already turning back to her phone. "Stop being so dramatic. It's just money. If you're that desperate, go beg Uncle Alan for an advance on your pittance of a salary. Now, get on your laptop and clear the block on the black card. I'm not missing Mykonos because you're having a tantrum over a few grand." Ginger felt the familiar heat of rage, but she didn't let it reach her face. Instead, she felt for the small, hard shape of the encrypted thumb drive hidden in her robe pocket. She thought of the button she had pressed the night before, the one that hadn't just frozen the cards, but had triggered a silent, irreversible notification to the board's forensic auditors. "You're right, Tessa," Ginger said, her voice as smooth as polished ice. "It is just money. And I think you'll find that the glitch in the system is much more permanent than you realize. In fact, I'd check your personal accounts, too. Security protocols tend to cascade once a breach is detected." Tessa froze, her thumb hovering over her screen. "What are you talking about?" "I'm saying that if I were you, I wouldn't worry about Mykonos," Ginger replied, finally meeting her sister's eyes with a chilling, predatory smile. "I'd worry about the fact that Uncle Alan and Dr. Connor are currently in the study with the bank's fraud department, and they're looking for that $10,000 you just admitted to taking." The color began to drain from Tessa's cheeks, a slow, satisfying crawl of white across her tan. Before she could speak, the heavy oak doors of the study at the end of the hall swung open, and the low, booming voice of Uncle Alan echoed through the house, calling for the family to assemble immediately. Ginger stood up, her movements fluid and strong, showing none of the frailty she had feigned for months. She leaned in close to her sister, catching the scent of fear beginning to rise beneath the floral perfume. "Wait for it," Ginger whispered. "That's the sound of the bill coming due." The heavy oak doors of the study groaned as they shut, sealing the family inside a room that smelled of ancient leather and stale cedar. Uncle Alan stood behind the massive mahogany desk, his shadow stretching long across the Persian rug. The only sound was the rhythmic, mocking tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Ginger J. Bradley took her seat in a velvet armchair, her posture unnervingly straight, while Tessa Bradley paced near the window, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood like gunfire. "Sit down, Tessa," Uncle Alan commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a man who had spent 40 years running a multi-million-dollar shipping empire. Tessa didn't sit. Instead, she turned, her face a mask of indignant fury. "This is ridiculous. You're actually listening to her. Uncle Alan, look at her. Ginger has been in a fog for months. Dr. Connor, you said it yourself. The trauma from the accident caused significant cognitive lag. She's probably hallucinating these missing funds because she can't balance a simple checkbook anymore." Dr. Connor shifted uncomfortably by the bookshelf, his eyes darting toward Ginger before landing on his clipboard. "The recovery process is complex, certainly. Confusion is a common side effect of—" "I'm not confused, Doctor," Ginger interrupted. Her voice was a cool blade, slicing through the tension. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small, silver USB drive. The metal felt cold against her palm, a tactile reminder of the months she'd spent late at night, her eyes burning as she sifted through the digital wreckage of the family's accounts, while everyone thought she was staring blankly at the television. "And I'm not hallucinating the $10,000 that moved from the Bradley Trust into a shell company registered to a boutique in Mykonos. A boutique where you, Tessa, happen to have a platinum-level membership." Tessa's laugh was high and brittle. "Oh, please, you're a data analyst, not a detective. You've always been jealous of my life, Ginger. You've sat in that chair like a broken toy, watching me live while you withered away. Now you're trying to claw back some relevance by playing gotcha with the family accounts." She leaned over Ginger, the cloying scent of her expensive floral perfume filling the space. "You're a charity case in this house, a tragic little footnote. Don't forget who took care of you when you couldn't even feed yourself." Ginger didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. You didn't take care of me, Tessa. You took advantage of the silence. You thought because I wasn't speaking, I wasn't recording. Enough, Uncle Alan barked, slamming a hand onto the desk. The sound made Cousin Abby jump in the corner, her eyes wide as she clutched her phone. Tessa, the bank's fraud department has already flagged the signatures. They don't match the trustee's authorization. They match your handwriting. The color finally drained from Tessa's face, leaving her tan looking like sallow parchment. She turned toward the doorway where Evelyn Bradley stood, the matriarch's face frozen in a mask of calculated neutrality. Mother, tell him it was an advance. I was going to put it back. Evelyn stepped into the room, the silk of her robe whispering against the floor. She didn't look at Tessa, she looked at Ginger. Ginger, darling, surely we can handle this internally. Think of the family's reputation. If the board hears about a criminal investigation involving your sister, the stock price will crater. We can just deduct it from Tessa's future inheritance. It's a family matter. The rage spike hit Ginger then, a hot, pulsing surge in her chest. Her own mother was asking her to bury a theft to protect a socialite's reputation. It was the same script they'd used her whole life. Ginger makes the sacrifices, Tessa makes the scenes, and Evelyn makes the excuses. It's not just $10,000, Mother, Ginger said, her voice dropping an octave. She stood up, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to shock everyone in the room. The frail girl was gone. That was just the string I pulled to see what would unravel. While I was drooling in my chair, as Tessa so eloquently put it, I was running a background audit on every account associated with the Bradley Foundation. She walked toward the desk and plugged the USB drive into Uncle Alan's laptop. With a few keystrokes, a series of spreadsheets filled the large monitor mounted on the wall. The secret power of her analytical mind was on full display, thousands of lines of data, color-coded and cross-referenced. Look at the red cells, Ginger directed. Those aren't just Tessa's shopping trips. Those are systematic withdrawals spanning 3 years. Over $400,000 is gone, and it didn't all go to Mykonos. The room went deathly silent. Aunt Lorna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Uncle Alan leaned forward, his eyes scanning the numbers with the intensity of a predator. Wait for it, Ginger whispered, her eyes locked on Tessa. What is this? Uncle Alan asked, his voice trembling with a new kind of rage. These transfers, they're authorized by a secondary digital key. A key that belongs to the head of the foundation, Ginger said. She turned her gaze slowly toward her mother. Isn't that right, Evelyn? Tessa let out a choked sound, a mix of a sob and a scream. You bitch, you're trying to destroy everything. She lunged toward the laptop, her fingers clawed, but Uncle Alan stepped in her way, his arm a solid barrier. I'm not destroying anything, Ginger said, her voice calm as a frozen lake. I'm simply performing an audit, and the audit is far from over. She turned back to Uncle Alan. The board of directors meeting is in 48 hours. I've already sent a preliminary summary to the external auditors. If you want to save the company, you have exactly 2 days to decide whose side of the glass you want to be on when it shatters. Ginger picked up her USB drive, the click of it disconnecting echoing in the silence. She walked toward the door, stopping only when she was inches from Tessa. She could see the cold sweat beating on her sister's upper lip, the way her chest heaved with panicked breath. 2 days, Tessa, Ginger whispered. Make them count. She walked out of the study, the heavy doors closing behind her, leaving the sounds of the first real Bradley war to erupt in her wake. She didn't look back. She had a phone call to make to a lawyer who had been waiting for this moment as long as she had. The air inside the gilded oak smelled of aged cedar and the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to raise its voice. Tessa sat at the center of a velvet semicircle, her laughter ringing out like a sharpened blade against the crystal flutes on the table. She was in her element here, surrounded by the daughters of board members and the wives of the city's elite, performing the role of the Bradley heiress with practiced ease. It's just a phase, she said, waving a hand dismissively as she adjusted the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. The stones caught the light, throwing fractured rainbows across the mahogany table. Ginger has always been a bit dramatic. She thinks a few weeks of looking at old receipts makes her the family savior. It's honestly adorable in a pathetic sort of way. Cousin Abby sat to her right, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass. She didn't join in the laughter this time. Instead, she kept glancing toward the heavy oak doors of the lounge, her expression tight. The doors swung open, and the room seemed to lose a few degrees of warmth. Ginger didn't march in. She moved with a terrifying, rhythmic stillness. She was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, her hair pulled back so tightly it emphasized the cold clarity in her eyes. She didn't look like the woman who had spent months in a hospital bed. She looked like the person who had designed the hospital and owned the land beneath it. Tessa didn't even turn around. She simply leaned back into the velvet, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh look, the auditor has arrived. Tell me, did you find a missing paperclip? Or are you here to tell us we're over budget on the hors d'oeuvres?" Ginger stopped 3 feet from the table. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the socialites until they began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. She didn't look at the others. Her gaze was locked on the back of her sister's head. "I'm here to give you a piece of advice, Tessa. One sister to another," Ginger said. Her voice was low, carrying a resonance that made a woman at the next table pause with her fork halfway to her mouth. Tessa finally turned, her eyes narrowed. "I don't remember asking for advice from the help." "Check your personal accounts," Ginger said calmly, "and I'd do it before the club closes for the evening." Tessa let out a sharp, jagged laugh. My accounts are fine. I just bought a vintage Porsche this morning. If you're trying to scare me with some clerical error you think you found, you're wasting your breath. I'm a Bradley. My name is the only collateral I need." "Names are just ink on paper when the ink runs dry," Ginger replied. She leaned down, bracing her hands on the table, bringing her face inches from her sister, S. The scent of Tessa's expensive, cloying perfume filled the space between them, but Ginger didn't flinch. "You've spent 3 years treating the company's operational budget like a personal piggy bank. You thought Uncle Alan wasn't looking. You thought Mom would always cover the spread." "Because she will," Tessa hissed, though the volume of her voice had dropped. "She's the head of the family. She's the head of a house built on sand," Ginger whispered. 24 hours, Tessa. That's all that's left on the clock. When the board meets tomorrow at noon, every single wire transfer you've authorized to your private offshore account will be projected on a 60-inch screen in high definition. I've already secured the digital signatures. There is no glitch to hide behind this time. Abby's face went bone white. She looked from Ginger to Tessa, her breath hitching. "Tessa, maybe we should." "Shut up, Abby," Tessa snapped, but the hand she used to reach for her champagne was trembling. She forced a smile for the benefit of her watching friends, a brittle, terrifying mask of confidence. "You're bluffing. You've always been jealous that I was the one who fit in here while you were stuck in a cubicle counting other people's money." Ginger straightened up, smoothing the front of her jacket. She looked around the table, her eyes lingering on each of the witnesses. "Enjoy the vintage, ladies. It's the last bottle that will be charged to the Bradley corporate line." She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking a steady, funeral march on the marble floor. She didn't look back to see Tessa frantically pulling her phone from her designer clutch. She didn't need to. As Ginger reached the lobby, she saw Uncle Alan standing by the tall windows, his shadow long and dark against the sunset. He didn't say a word, but the way he gripped his cane told her everything. He had heard. He was watching the collapse begin, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't reaching out to stop it. Ginger stepped out into the cool evening air, pulling her phone from her pocket. She dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "It's me," she said, her voice steady as the city lights began to flicker on. "The board meeting is set for tomorrow. Everything is in place. Make sure the forensic team is standing by. I want the locks changed the second the vote is finalized." She ended the call and looked up at the darkening sky. The countdown had reached its final stretch. Tomorrow, the name Bradley would mean something entirely different. And for Tessa, the world was about to become very, very small. The scent of white lilies was the first thing that hit Ginger J. Bradley as she stepped into the conservatory. It was a cloying, funeral smell that didn't belong in a house that was supposed to be celebrating a legacy. The room was bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun, making the dust motes dancing in the air look like gold, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. Tessa Bradley sat at the center of the room in a velvet armchair, looking every bit the grieving saint. She was dressed in a silk wrap that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, her fingers idly tracing the rim of a crystal glass. Beside her stood their mother, Evelyn, whose face was a mask of practiced concern. Uncle Alan sat in the corner, his hands folded over his cane, his eyes unreadable. Aunt Lorna and Cousin Abby were positioned on the periphery, looking like reluctant witnesses to a trial that hadn't officially begun. "You're late, dear," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like poison. "We were beginning to worry your episodes were getting the better of you." Ginger didn't sit. She stood by the marble mantelpiece, the stone cold against her palm. She could feel the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a small piece of plastic that held the power to incinerate the room. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice steady. "Is she, though?" Tessa looked up, a sharp, entitled smirk cutting through her mask of pity. She turned her gaze to the man sitting in the shadows next to Uncle Alan. "Dr. Connor, thank you for coming on such short notice. As you can see, my sister is a bit defensive." Dr. Connor cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. He looked professional, but Ginger noticed the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. He was a specialist in discreet family transitions, the kind of man wealth bought when it needed to make a problem disappear quietly. "Ginger," the doctor started, his tone patronizing, "your family has expressed some very serious concerns regarding your mental state. The obsessive behavior, the paranoia regarding the company's records, the isolation. These are often markers of a significant break from reality." The audacity of it made the air in the room feel thin. Tessa leaned forward, her perfume, a heavy, expensive jasmine, filling the space between them. "We just want what's best for you, Ginger. All this talk of forensic audits and missing funds, it's delusional. You've been under so much stress since the accident. Maybe a few months at the Willow Creek facility would help you find your feet again." Willow Creek wasn't a hospital. It was a gilded cage for the inconveniently wealthy. "A few months?" Ginger asked softly. "Just long enough for the board vote tomorrow." Tessa laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the glass walls. "See, this is exactly what I mean. Everything is a conspiracy to her. She thinks I'm trying to steal her seat when in reality I'm the only one trying to save the Bradley name from the embarrassment of her public breakdown." She turned to Uncle Alan. "You see it, don't you? She's not fit to hold a pen, let alone a vote." Uncle Alan didn't speak. He simply watched, his grip tightening on his cane. Ginger felt the rage spike in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She looked at Cousin Abby, who was staring at her shoes, her face pale. Abby knew. She had seen the preliminary data Ginger had sent her, and the fear in the girl's eyes told Ginger that the intervention wasn't just for her. It was a warning to anyone else who might think of switching sides. "I've spent the last 3 weeks looking at the ledger for the Bradley Foundation," Ginger said, her voice dropping an octave. The room went silent, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "The one you manage, Tessa. It's fascinating how $3 million can just vanish into a shell company registered in the Caymans under a maiden name our grandmother hasn't used in 40 years. Tessa's face didn't crumble, not yet. Instead, it hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Dr. Connor, note the fixation on numbers. It's a classic coping mechanism for someone losing their grip on the world." She stood up, walking toward Ginger until they were inches apart. "Give me your phone, Ginger, and your laptop. You're clearly having a manic episode, and for your own safety, we can't have you contacting the board with these fantasies." "And if I don't?" Ginger asked. "Then Dr. Connor has the papers ready for an involuntary hold," Evelyn added from the shadows, her voice cold. "For your own protection, of course." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Ginger looked at the crystal glass in Tessa's hand. She could see the slight tremor in her sister's fingers, the only sign that the sleeping lion was finally starting to wake up. "You think you've won," Ginger said, looking directly into Tessa's eyes. "You think that if you lock me away for 48 hours, the vote will pass, the audit will be buried, and you can keep playing at being a socialite with stolen money." "I don't think I've won, Ginger," Tessa whispered, her voice thick with entitlement. "I know I have. I am the Bradley legacy. You're just the girl who survived a crash and lost her mind in the process. Nobody believes a broken woman. Ginger reached into her pocket. Tessa flinched, thinking she was pulling out a weapon, but Ginger only pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen once and laid it on the marble mantel. "Wait for it," Ginger murmured. "Wait for what?" Tessa sneered. "Your imaginary friends to come save you." A sharp knock echoed through the house, followed by the heavy sound of the front door opening. The sound of firm, rhythmic footsteps on the hardwood floor moved toward the conservatory. Aunt Lorna stood up, her eyes bright with a sudden, sharp realization. Uncle Alan finally looked up from his cane, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "That would be the forensic team from the DA's office," Ginger said, her voice as cold as the marble she leaned against. "I didn't just call the board, Tessa. I called the authorities, and unlike Dr. Connor, they don't take payment in family favors." The color began to drain from Tessa's face, a slow, sickly transformation that started at her temples and bled down to her throat. Her hand gripped the crystal glass so hard it looked like it might shatter. "You wouldn't," Evelyn gasped, stepping forward. "You'd destroy the family for a grudge." "I'm not destroying the family," Ginger replied, picking up her phone as the shadows of 3 men appeared at the conservatory entrance. "I'm just changing the locks. And Tessa, you might want to put that drink down. I have a feeling you're going to need your wits about you for what comes next." The lead investigator stepped into the light, a blue folder in his hand. He didn't look at the flowers or the velvet chairs. He looked straight at Tessa Bradley. "We have a warrant for the seizure of all financial records related to the Bradley Foundation," he announced. Ginger stepped past her sister, the scent of jasmine fading as she reached the door. She paused, looking back one last time at the intervention that had turned into a trap. "The board meeting is at 9 a.m. tomorrow," Ginger said softly. "I'll see you there, if you're not too busy with the depositions." She walked out into the cool night air, leaving the cloying smell of lilies behind. The countdown hadn't just reached its final stretch. The explosion had already begun. And as she looked up at the stars, Ginger realized that for the first time in years, she could finally breathe. The mahogany boardroom table felt like an island of cold, polished stone in a sea of rising tension. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the sharp, ozone tang of the high-end air purifier humming in the corner. Tessa Bradley sat at the head of the table, her fingers tapping a restless, rhythmic beat against the glass top. She wore a tailored cream suit that probably cost more than the data analysts in the basement made in a year, and she looked at the heavy oak doors as if she could command them to stay shut by sheer force of will. Uncle Alan stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the morning sun. He didn't look at his niece. He looked at the blue folder resting in front of the empty chair at the far end of the table. "This is an embarrassment, Alan," Tessa snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a serrated blade. "Ginger has clearly had some sort of mental break, to bring investigators into my home, to suggest that I, the face of this foundation, would mismanage a single cent. It's a transparent attempt to grab power because she's jealous of my success." Cousin Abby, sitting 2 seats down, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between the door and the folder. She didn't offer her usual chirp of agreement. The silence from the rest of the board was a physical weight. The doors opened. Ginger J. Bradley walked in with a stride that was neither hurried nor hesitant. She didn't look like the sleeping lion anymore. She looked like the person who had already won. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back, her expression as unreadable as a blank spreadsheet. She didn't offer an apology for being late. She simply sat down, the soft click of her briefcase latches sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here," Tessa sneered, leaning forward. Her eyes were bright with a manic, defensive energy. "I've already spoken to the legal team. We're filing for a restraining order and a defamation suit. You're done, Ginger. You're a footnote in this family's history." Ginger didn't flinch. She didn't even look up as she pulled a small, silver USB drive from her pocket. "The audit is complete," she said, her voice calm, low, and terrifyingly steady. "I don't care about your little hobby project," Tessa shouted, her composure finally fraying at the edges. "You're a data entry clerk. You don't understand how high-level philanthropy works. Some of us are built for the spotlight. Others, like you, are meant to stay in the shadows and stay quiet. I was quiet for 3 years, Ginger replied. She glanced at Uncle Alan, who finally turned away from the window. But the data wasn't. She reached out and tapped the remote on the table. The massive projector screen at the front of the room hummed to life. Tessa, stop talking, Uncle Alan said. It wasn't a suggestion. The first slide appeared. It wasn't a graph or a mission statement. It was a high-resolution scan of a wire transfer. $500,000 moved from the Bradley Foundation's Disaster Relief Fund to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary, a boutique interior design firm in Paris that had recently completed work on Tessa's private penthouse. The transformation in Tessa Bradley's expression was visceral. The smug, practiced curve of her lips didn't just fade, it curdled. Her skin, usually a perfect porcelain thanks to monthly chemical peels, drained of all warmth until she resembled a wax figure left too close to a flame. Her eyes, once wide with indignant fury, narrowed into frantic slits that darted across the screen, searching for a lie that wasn't there. A fine tremor started at the corner of her jaw, a rhythmic twitch that betrayed the absolute collapse of her composure. Her mouth hung slightly open, her breath hitching in a series of shallow, audible gasps that cut through the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. She looked smaller, suddenly, as if the expensive suit was the only thing holding her upright. That's a fabrication, Tessa whispered, but the conviction was gone. Her voice sounded thin, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Cousin Abby let out a sharp, audible gasp, physically pushing her chair back several inches as if the proximity to Tessa had suddenly become toxic. Dr. Connor, the board's longest-serving member, took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, his face a mask of profound disappointment. There are 42 more slides, Ginger said, her voice echoing in the stillness. Flights, jewelry, a literal yacht rental categorized as community outreach. All signed by you, all verified by the forensic team. Ginger stood up. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply closed her briefcase. You told me I didn't belong in this room, Tessa, she said, looking her sister directly in the eye for the first time. You were right. I don't belong in a room full of thieves. The board has the documents. The authorities have the originals. Ginger turned toward the door, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the wreckage of her sister's life. I'd tell you to call your lawyer, Ginger said softly, but I've already frozen the accounts you were going to use to pay him. She walked out, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her, leaving the sound of Tessa's first, panicked sob to be swallowed by the silence of the hall. The elevator was waiting, but as the doors slid shut, Ginger saw Uncle Alan emerge from the boardroom, his face pale, reaching for his phone. The collapse wasn't over. The real fallout was just beginning. The elevator chimes were the only sound in the sudden, ringing vacuum of the hallway. Ginger J. Bradley stepped into the car, the scent of her sister's expensive, cloying perfume still clinging to her skin like a film she couldn't wait to wash off. She pressed the button for the lobby, her finger steady, the cool metal a grounding contrast to the heat of the boardroom she had just dismantled. As the doors slid shut, she caught a final glimpse of the chaos. The silhouette of her sister standing frozen amidst the wreckage of a reputation that had taken 30 years to build and only 30 minutes to destroy. The descent was smooth, but the silence inside the brass-lined car felt heavy with the weight of years of suppressed data. Ginger checked her watch. In precisely 4 minutes, the digital lock she had placed on the Bradley offshore accounts would transition from a temporary freeze to a permanent audit lock. The money wasn't just gone. It was visible to every regulatory eye in the state. When the doors opened into the marble expanse of the lobby, the air smelled of lemon wax and the damp, metallic scent of an impending afternoon storm. She didn't hurry. She walked with the measured pace of a woman who knew exactly where the exits were. Ginger, stop right there. The screech echoed off the high ceilings, sharp enough to make the concierge flinch. Tessa Bradley burst from the service stairs, her hair, usually a masterpiece of socialite perfection, beginning to fray at the temples. She was panting, her chest heaving under a silk blouse that cost more than Ginger's first car. She looked less like a corporate titan and more like a cornered animal. "You think you've won?" Tessa's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the professional hush of the lobby. "You think Uncle Alan is actually going to let you walk away with this? You're a data analyst, Ginger. You're a glorified bookkeeper. You don't have the stomach for what happens next." Ginger stopped and turned. She didn't need to raise her voice. The lobby was a natural amphitheater, and 3 security guards, 2 receptionists, and a group of visiting consultants were already leaning in. "What happens next, Tessa, is the law," Ginger said, her voice dropping into a register of calm that seemed to infuriate her sister more than a shout ever could. "The stomach for it. I've spent 6 months digesting your theft while I sat in that recovery chair you called a vacation. I've had plenty of time to build up an appetite." Tessa's face didn't just drop. It seemed to dissolve in real time. The carefully curated mask of the Bradley heiress shattered, leaving behind a frantic, hollow-eyed stranger. Her lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that sent a ripple through her jaw, making her teeth click together like dry bone. The vibrant, ugly flush of her rage was replaced by a sallow, waxen gray that started at her hairline and bled down to her throat. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculation, darted wildly, losing focus, as the pupils dilated until the blue of her irises was nothing more than a thin, jagged ring. It was the look of a woman who had finally looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was her own reflection. She reached for the marble pillar beside her, her fingers scratching against the stone as if trying to find a secret door that no longer existed. "I'll tell Mother," Tessa whispered, the threat sounding pathetic even to her own ears. "She'll cut you off. She'll make sure you never work in this city again." "Mother already knows," a new voice interrupted. Uncle Alan stepped out from the private elevator bank, followed closely by Cousin Abby. Abby wasn't looking at Tessa. She was looking at the tablet in her hands, her face set in a mask of professional distance. "Actually," Abby said, her voice cool as she finally looked up at her cousin, "I just finished forwarding the last of the encrypted chat logs to the board. The ones where you discussed liquidating Ginger's personal trust while she was in the hospital. It's all there, Tessa, every word." The betrayal hit Tessa like a physical blow. She turned to Abby, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out except a wet, desperate wheeze. Uncle Alan stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. He didn't look at Ginger. His eyes were fixed on the niece who had spent years gaslighting him. "The authorities are in the boardroom, Tessa. They're waiting for you to explain why there are 3 sets of books for the foundation. I suggest you go back up and start talking before they decide to come down here and get you in front of the evening news." Tessa looked around the lobby. The security guards, men who had opened doors for her and carried her bags for a decade, stood like statues. They didn't move to help her. They didn't even look her in the eye. The power inversion was absolute. She was no longer the princess of the Bradley Empire. She was a liability in a designer suit. "Ginger, please," Tessa gasped, turning back to her sister. "We're family. You can't do this to me. Think of the name. Think of what this will do to the Bradley legacy." Ginger adjusted the strap of her bag, her expression unmoved. "I am thinking of the legacy, Tessa. That's why I'm cutting out the rot." She turned toward the heavy glass revolving doors. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain were beginning to crater the dusty sidewalk. "You told me I was the shadow in this family," Ginger said, pausing just before the glass. "Shadows are patient, Tessa. They see everything because people like you are too busy looking at your own reflection to notice us. But even shadows disappear when the lights finally come on." She pushed through the door. The sound of the city, the roar of traffic, the hiss of the rain, the distant siren, swallowed the sound of Tessa's final, hysterical scream of "I'll kill you." Ginger didn't look back. She walked to the curb where a dark sedan was already waiting. She felt the weight of the last 6 months slide off her shoulders, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The reckoning was far from over, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one waiting for the blow to fall. As the car pulled away, she saw a fleet of black SUVs pull up to the front of the Bradley building. Men in windbreakers with federal seals moved toward the entrance. Ginger leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. The phone in her hand buzzed. A message from Aunt Lorna. The safe house is ready. Dr. Connor is waiting. It's time to disappear, Ginger. At least for a while. She watched the Bradley building shrink in the rearview mirror, a monument to a lie that was finally being dismantled brick by brick. The hunter had become the prey, and the prey was already miles away, hidden in the gray rain of the city. But as the car turned the corner, Ginger saw one thing that made her blood run cold. A silver sports car she recognized all too well, idling 2 blocks away, its headlights flashing twice in the gloom. The cord wasn't just cut, it was frayed, and someone was still holding the other end. 6 months had passed since the silver sports car had been towed from the curb outside the safe house, its driver hauled away in the same plastic zip ties that had eventually bound the rest of the Bradley legacy. Ginger J. Bradley sat in a corner office that didn't smell like her father's stale cigar smoke or her mother's suffocating, expensive lilies. Instead, the air here was crisp, carrying the faint, sharp scent of ozone and the fresh rain that streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows. She adjusted the cuff of her navy silk blouse, feeling the cool weight of the fabric against her skin, a far cry from the hospital gowns and the itchy, oversized sweaters she'd worn while hiding in the shadows of her own life. Uncle Alan stood by the window, his reflection a gray silhouette against the darkening city skyline. He looked older, the lines around his mouth etched deeper by the scandal that had gutted the family business, but his shoulders were square for the first time in a decade. "The final liquidations are signed, Ginger," he said, his voice echoing softly against the minimalist glass walls. "The restitution is being processed for the employees Mom defrauded. You've done more for the Bradley name by dismantling it than we ever did by trying to save it." Ginger nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of a heavy silver pen. It was the same pen she had used to sign the affidavits that sent her mother to a federal facility and stripped her sister of every cent she hadn't already squandered on vanity. "It wasn't about the name, Alan. It was about the math. The numbers finally had to balance." "I know," he sighed, turning to look at her with a mixture of pride and lingering sadness. "Aunt Lorna says you're finally sleeping through the night without the lights on." "Is that true?" "Most nights," Ginger replied, though the lie felt small and necessary. The geography of her mind was still healing, the scars of years of gaslighting still tender to the touch, but the silence no longer felt like a threat. Later that afternoon, Ginger found herself in a part of the city she used to only see through the tinted windows of a limousine. She sat in the back of a nondescript sedan, watching the entrance of a crumbling brick laundromat. The smell of cheap detergent and hot exhaust drifted through the vents. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped out, struggling with a heavy plastic basket of damp clothes. It was Tessa Bradley. The designer heels that had once clicked arrogantly across marble floors were gone, replaced by scuffed, generic sneakers. Her hair, once a masterpiece of high-end salon work, was pulled back in a frizzy, uneven knot. She wore a stained polyester vest with a cracked name tag that read temp staff. Ginger watched as her sister fumbled with a handful of coins at a rusted vending machine. When the machine swallowed her last quarter without releasing the bag of chips, Tessa didn't just sigh, she exploded. She kicked the base of the machine, her face contorting into that familiar, ugly mask of entitlement. "Useless piece of junk," she shrieked, her voice thin and desperate in the empty street. "Do you have any idea who I am? I shouldn't be here. This is a mistake." A passerby didn't even turn his head. To the world, she was just another bitter woman shouting at a machine. The realization hit Ginger with the force of a physical blow. Tessa hadn't changed at all. She was still a queen without a throne, trying to command the very dirt beneath her feet. Ginger rolled down her window just an inch. The humid air felt heavy. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a single white envelope, the final notice of eviction for the studio apartment the estate had been subsidizing as a courtesy. It was the last thread connecting them. She stepped out of the car. The sound of her boots on the cracked pavement was steady and deliberate. Tessa froze, the basket of laundry slipping from her hip and spilling graying towels onto the sidewalk. "Ginger." Tessa's voice was a jagged mix of hope and venom. Did you finally come to your senses? Did you come to bring me home? This joke has gone on long enough. Look at my hands. The industrial soap is ruining my skin. I can't live like this. Ginger looked at the hands that had once hidden her medication and pushed her down a flight of stairs. There is no home to go back to, Tessa. The estate was sold to a development firm yesterday. The locks were changed an hour ago. Tessa's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. You can't do that. Where am I supposed to go? Mom said you'd eventually fold. She said you were too weak to stay mad. Our mother is exactly where her choices put her, Ginger said, her voice as cold and clear as mountain water. And as of 5 p.m. today, so are you. She handed over the envelope. The subsidy is over. I've arranged a one-time placement at a vocational center across the state. If you show up, they'll teach you how to actually earn a living. If you don't. She let the sentence hang, as heavy as the storm clouds gathering overhead. You're a monster, Tessa hissed, her fingers trembling as she snatched the paper. You took everything. My clothes, my car, my friends. You even turned Cousin Abby against me. I took the things you stole from me, Ginger corrected. She turned back toward the car, her heart surprisingly light, as if a great weight had finally been cut loose. I'm leaving now. Don't call the office. Dr. Connor says my recovery depends on removing all toxins from my environment. You are the last one, Tessa. As the car pulled away, Ginger looked in the rearview mirror. Her sister was standing alone on the sidewalk, clutching the eviction notice in one hand and a damp towel in the other. A small, shrinking figure against a city that had already forgotten her name. Ginger leaned back into the leather seat and closed her eyes. She had won. She had the firm, her health, and a justice so absolute it felt like a physical law. But as she thought of the empty chairs at the last holiday dinner, she felt the quiet ache of the cost. Cousin Abby was in therapy 3 states away. Uncle Alan was tired. The family tree had been pruned so severely that only a few branches remained. She watched the first drops of rain hit the glass, the sound a soft, persistent tapping. The war was over. The hunter had retired, and the prey had been neutralized. It was a lonely kind of peace, but as the car moved forward into the gray afternoon, Ginger realized she could finally breathe without permission. For the first time in 26 years, the air was entirely hers.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.